The land had already killed 2 men before Elias Cord ever set foot on it. That was the whisper that followed him from the auction table in Redemption Creek all the way down the cracked dirt road to the property line. Whispered by the auctioneer's assistant, muttered between the teeth of ranchers who'd stood in the crowd with their arms folded and their bids buried in their pockets. Nobody wanted the Harlan homestead. Nobody with sense, anyway. But Elias Cord had traded sense for survival a long time ago, and the $62.40 he'd scraped together from 4 months of fence mending and stable mucking was every dollar he owned in the world. He stood at the edge of his new land on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1873, the sky the color of old pewter and the wind carrying the particular bite of a high desert season changing its mind. The valley stretched before him, wide, shallow, and mean-looking, hemmed in by rust-colored ridges that seemed to lean inward like spectators waiting for something to go wrong. The grass was sparse and pale. The creek that was supposed to run through the eastern corner had pulled back to a muddy thread. The farmhouse, a low and listing structure of weathered pine, stood at an angle that suggested it had been attempting to walk away for years and simply run out of will. Elias Cord was 34 years old, lean as a fence rail, with broad shoulders that hadn't quite filled back out after 2 winters of going light on meals. His hair was the dark brown of river mud, worn short under a battered hat with a sweat-stained band and a brim that had been bent and rebent so many times it had given up pretending to hold a shape. His jaw was strong and clean-shaved, his eyes a steady pale gray that people sometimes found unsettling. Not because they were cold, but because they looked at things the way a carpenter looks at a warped board, measuring the problem before committing to a solution. He wore a canvas work coat, patched at both elbows, and boots that had been resoled once already and were due again. A single-action revolver rode on his right hip, not out of menace, but out of habit. The same habit that kept a man watching doorways and reading the posture of strangers in unfamiliar towns. He had not fired it at anything but rattlesnakes and a rabid coyote in 3 years, and he preferred it that way. He carried a single canvas bag over one shoulder and a long-handled spade lashed to the outside of it. He had a box of ammunition, a week's worth of dried provisions, a pocket Bible he never opened but couldn't bring himself to leave behind, and a folded document from the county registrar that said, in the language of official things, that all of this, the failing grass, the leaning house, the dead creek, the reluctant sky, belonged to him. He walked toward the farmhouse slowly, not from hesitation, but from the habit of a man who has learned to read land before he trusts it. The soil was harder than he expected this close to the house, almost compacted, as though something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly, and the ground had simply given up trying to recover. There was an old wagon tongue lying in the weeds to the left of the door, stripped of its hardware. A rusted hand pump stood beside a dry stone trough near the east wall. Above the door, someone had nailed a length of horseshoe iron in the old good luck fashion, open end up, so fortune wouldn't spill out. It had been there long enough that the wood around the nail had darkened and cracked. Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder because the latch had rusted through, and stood for a moment in the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. The interior was one large room with a sleeping loft above, reached by a ladder nailed to the back wall. A stone fireplace occupied the entire north wall, wide enough to roast a whole side of beef. The floor was rough-cut pine, warped in places, with gaps between the boards wide enough to lose a coin. A single table and 2 chairs remained, both solid enough despite years of abandonment. Someone had left a tin cup on the table. It had been there long enough to leave a ring of rust on the wood. He set his bag down on the table and stood in the middle of the room for a moment with his hands at his sides, taking stock. It was not a good house, but it was a house that could be made good, and that was the only distinction that mattered to a man in his position. He had built from worse. He had lived through worse. He did not know, standing there in the thin autumn light filtering through gaps in the shuttered windows, that the house was the least of what the land had to offer him. He did not know that the previous owner had not simply failed here, had not simply lost the fight against drought and debt and the particular cruelty of Hidden Valley's rocky soil. He did not know what was buried 22 feet from the back wall of that house, in a spot where the ground sat just slightly higher than the terrain around it. A subtle elevation that a tired man might walk over 100 times without noticing, but that a man who knew how to read the earth might eventually stop and consider. He didn't know any of that yet. He put his hat on a nail by the door and got to work. If you enjoyed this story so far, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more where this came from, and you won't want to miss what happens next in Hidden Valley. The first 3 days on the Harlan homestead were honest, unremarkable labor. Elias patched the worst of the roof gaps with tar paper and cut timber from the ridge stand above the property. He repaired the door latch, rehung a shutter that had been dangling from a single hinge, and cleaned the fireplace flue of a decade's worth of bird nests and collapsed debris. He cleared the dry trough, found the underground pipe that fed it, and followed it back to a hand-dug cistern behind the house that was cracked at the base but still structurally salvageable. He made notes in a small, leather-bound book. Not a journal, just a working ledger of what needed doing and in what order. He was not a man given to sentiment or self-pity, and his notes reflected that. Repair cistern, mortar and stone. Regrade drainage east of house. Assess soil quality near creek bed. Determine if creek recoverable or seasonal. On the 4th day, he walked the full perimeter of the property. It was larger than it looked from the road, almost 90 acres in total, which was why the price had seemed almost reasonable even to a man with $62. The problem was that roughly 70 of those acres were what hill country farmers called argument land, too rocky to plow, too thin-soiled to graze reliably, too steep in places to work without risk. The remaining 20 acres in the valley floor were what they were: tired soil, underwatered, worked hard by the previous owners, and then abandoned mid-rotation. He walked slowly, picking up handfuls of earth and rubbing them between his fingers. He had grown up farming in Missouri before circumstance and a bad season had pushed him west, and he had learned soil the way some men learn faces, by feel, by color, by the way it held together or didn't. The valley floor soil was not dead. That was the thing that struck him. It was depleted, yes. Overworked, yes. But there was still something working in it, some persistence of organic life that a truly ruined soil didn't have. With proper rotation, with water, with a year or two of patience, it could come back. The creek was the question. He followed it to where it had retreated, a narrow, slow-moving thread of brown water that looked like it had lost an argument. He knelt at the bank and dug his fingers into the creek bed, pulling up a handful of the sediment below the waterline. It was dark and dense, loaded with silt. He looked upstream, toward the narrow canyon where the creek came down from the ridge above. Something had changed up there. The flow was wrong, too thin for this time of year, even in a dry autumn. Either there was a blockage somewhere up the canyon, or something had diverted the upper flow. He put it on the list. Investigate upper creek source, possible blockage. That evening, he cooked over the fireplace, dried beans and salt pork, the kind of meal that keeps a man alive without giving him anything to look forward to, and sat in one of the 2 chairs with his ledger open, going over his calculations by the light of a tallow candle. The numbers were not comfortable reading. He had enough provisions for 2 more weeks. After that, he would need to ride into Redemption Creek for supplies, which would cost money he'd have to earn first, which meant finding work in the area while simultaneously trying to get his own place into working condition. It was the particular trap of the broke homesteader. Every hour spent earning money elsewhere was an hour not spent building the thing that was supposed to eventually replace the need to earn money elsewhere. He closed the ledger and looked at the fire for a while. He was not a man who gave despair much room, not because he was incapable of it, but because he had found, over the course of a difficult life, that despair was expensive. It cost time, energy, and clarity, all 3 of which he needed for the work in front of him. So he allowed himself 30 seconds of honest acknowledgement. This is hard. This is very uncertain. This may not work. And then he folded it up and put it somewhere internal and inaccessible, and thought instead about the creek. The creek was the key. He knew that with the certainty of a man who had farmed enough land to understand what water meant. Fix the water, and the 20 valley floor acres became productive. Let the water problem stand, and no amount of labor on the soil would matter. He went to bed early and slept hard, the way men sleep when they have worked their bodies past the point of restlessness. On the 5th day, he went up the canyon. The canyon above the homestead was narrow, maybe 40 feet wide at its widest point, with walls of red and ochre sandstone rising steeply on both sides. The creek wound through it in a series of shallow bends, each one a little slower and thinner than the last as he moved upstream. He followed it for nearly a mile before he found what he was looking for. And then he stopped walking and stood very still for a moment, because what he found was not what he had expected. The creek had been blocked, but not by nature. Someone had built a diversion dam, crude but effective, about 40 yards upstream of a natural bend in the canyon. It was built from stacked flat stones and packed clay, reinforced with old timber that had been cut, not fallen. The dam redirected the majority of the creek's flow into a side channel that ran north along the base of the canyon wall before disappearing into a long, gentle slope that led away from the valley entirely. The diversion was not recent. The clay had dried and settled over what looked like at least 2 or 3 years. But it was deliberate, and it was maintained. He could see where stones had been restacked in one section, the fresh clay around them still slightly darker than the surrounding material. Someone had intentionally starved the Harlan homestead of water, and someone, in the not-too-distant past, had come back to make sure it stayed that way. Elias stood looking at the dam for a long time with that carpenter's assessment in his gray eyes. Then he looked at the side channel, tracing where it went. He followed it north along the canyon base for about a quarter mile until it fed into a wide, shallow holding pond behind a low earthen berm. A livestock pond, well constructed, with signs of regular use. Beyond the pond, through a gap in the canyon wall, he could see open rangeland stretching north. Good rangeland. Properly watered rangeland. He pulled his hat off and held it in both hands, looking at the pond. Someone had taken the creek that belonged to the Harlan homestead, that ran through the Harlan homestead, that was registered to the Harlan homestead in the county land office, and rerouted it to water their own cattle. Elias put his hat back on. He looked back up the canyon toward the diversion dam. He looked north toward the rangeland beyond the pond. His jaw was set, and there was something working behind those pale gray eyes that was not anger exactly, It was more like the careful, focused attention of a man identifying the precise nature of a problem before deciding what to do about it. He walked back down the canyon to his homestead and wrote 3 words in his ledger: "Find the neighbor." Redemption Creek was a 2-hour ride east on a horse Elias didn't own yet, so he walked it. He left before dawn on the 6th morning, carrying nothing but his coat, his revolver, and the folded land document from the county registrar. He arrived in town around mid-morning when the main street was lively with the particular activity of a working frontier settlement. A blacksmith's hammer ringing from one end, a teamster arguing with a freight agent at the other, and in between, the usual parade of horses, wagons, cowhands, and townspeople going about the business of a Thursday. He went to the county land office first, a small frame building wedged between the hardware store and the telegraph office. The clerk inside was a thin man in his 40s with spectacles and the slightly harassed expression of someone who dealt with disputed paperwork for a living. Elias laid his land document on the counter and asked to see the survey records for the adjacent properties to the north and northwest of the Harlan Homestead in Hidden Valley. The clerk looked at him, then at the document, then back at him. "Harlan Place," the clerk said. It wasn't a question. Something passed across his face, not quite discomfort, but in that neighborhood. "That's right," Elias said. "I bought it at auction 3 weeks ago." "I recall," the clerk said. He went to the filing cabinet without further comment and returned with a survey ledger, which he laid open on the counter. He turned it to face Elias without apparent enthusiasm. The land to the north of the Harlan homestead, the land where the water ended up, was registered to a man named Douglas Aldrin. The property was large, nearly 400 acres of valley and canyon rangeland, held free and clear. Aldrin's land began at the northern edge of the canyon where Elias had found the diversion dam, which meant the dam itself sat in a legal gray zone. The canyon was registered to the Harlan property, which meant Elias owned the ground the dam was built on. He looked at the survey lines carefully. He was not a lawyer, and he knew it, but he had read enough land documents in enough counties to understand what he was looking at. The water was his. The creek was his. The diversion dam sat on his property. He thanked the clerk, folded his document, and walked back out into the street. He asked about Douglas Aldrin at the hardware store, where a broad woman named Mrs. Hatch, who apparently knew everything about everyone, informed him, while wrapping a paper parcel of nails, that Aldrin was the biggest cattle rancher in the Hidden Valley area, that he had been ranching there for over 15 years, that he was not a man who enjoyed being questioned about his business arrangements, and that the 2 previous owners of the Harlan homestead had both left the property under circumstances that Mrs. Hatch described with careful vagueness as not entirely voluntary. Elias looked at her steadily. They were pushed out? Mrs. Hatch concentrated on her nail wrapping. I couldn't say anything about that directly. But indirectly. She tied the parcel with twine and set it on the counter. I'll just say that land in Hidden Valley has a way of ending up belonging to Mr. Aldrin in the end, one way or another. She looked up at him then, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had watched things she didn't like from the careful distance of a woman who had a business to protect. You bought yourself a difficult piece of property, mister. Seems like it, Elias said. He paid for the nails, he'd needed them anyway, and left. He did not go looking for Douglas Aldrin that day. Not because he was afraid to, but because he wanted to think first. And because a man who walks into a confrontation before he understands the full shape of it tends to walk out of it worse off than when he went in. He had enough information now to know what he was dealing with. He needed a little more before he decided how to deal with it. He walked back to the homestead, arrived after dark, built a fire, and thought. On the 7th day, he pulled down the diversion dam. It took him most of the morning. The stones were heavy and the packed clay was stubborn, but he worked at it methodically, breaking the clay with the sharp end of his spade and rolling the stones aside one by one. By noon, the dam was down to a rubble scatter along the canyon floor, and the creek had found its original channel again, tentatively at first, pushing through the loosened sediment, and then with growing confidence as the blockage cleared, running south toward the valley floor where it belonged, where it had always belonged, where it had been going before someone decided to take it. Elias stood at the edge of the creek and watched the water move for a while. It ran brown with disturbed silt and would need a few days to clear, but it was running, and the sound of it, that simple, practical sound of moving water in a dry canyon, felt like something being set right in a fundamental way. He walked back down to the homestead and built up the bank where the creek entered the valley, directing the flow toward the dry trough and the cracked cistern. He had a plan for proper irrigation channels along the south field that would need another week to implement. But first, the water had to run. And now, it was running. He ate lunch sitting on the porch step, such as it was, a single flat stone, and looked out over the valley. He did not have to wait long for Douglas Aldrin. The rancher arrived on horseback the following morning, just after sunrise, with 2 men behind him. Aldrin was a large man, broad through the chest, somewhere in his mid-50s, with silver hair beneath a good quality hat, and the kind of deliberate, settled posture of a man who has spent 30 years being the largest presence in every room he enters. His face was weathered and composed, not angry, not yet, but carrying the controlled tension of a man who has discovered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond to it. The 2 men behind him were cowhands, young and watchful. Their horses stopped just far enough back to suggest they were there as presence rather than immediate threat. They kept their hands visible and their expressions neutral. Elias stood on the flat stone that served as his porch step and watched them approach. He had seen them coming from a quarter-mile out and had had time to pick up his coffee cup and adopt a posture of complete unhurriedness, which was both a practical choice and a statement. Aldrin stopped his horse 20 feet out and looked at Elias with the particular quality of attention that powerful men reserve for things that have surprised them. "You tore down my dam," Aldrin said. "Wasn't your dam," Elias said. "It was on my property, diverting water that belongs to my creek." "I have the survey documents if you'd like to review them." Aldrin's jaw moved slightly, as if he were organizing words before letting them out. "That dam has been there for 3 years." "That's a fact about how long it's been there," Elias said. "It's not a fact about whose water it was taking." The 2 cowhands exchanged a glance. Aldrin looked at Elias for a moment longer, and Elias looked back at him with those steady gray eyes that measured things. "You know who I am?" Aldrin asked. "Douglas Aldrin," Elias said. 400 acres north of here. Been ranching Hidden Valley for 15 years. You're the reason the last 2 owners of this property couldn't make a go of it." He paused. "I reckon you expected a third." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man recalculating. "You're going to make trouble," Aldrin said. It wasn't a threat yet. It was more like a diagnosis. "Not if you leave my water alone," Elias said simply. "I'm just a farmer trying to work his land. I've got no quarrel with you unless you make one." Aldrin looked around at the property. The patched roof, the cleared trough, the creek running where it was supposed to run. Something moved in his expression, too briefly to read. "That land has broken better men than you," he said, and turned his horse. The two cowhands followed without a word. Elias watched them go until they crested the ridge at the north end of the valley and disappeared. He finished his coffee, put the cup down, went back to work on the irrigation channel. 2 weeks passed in hard, productive labor. The creek ran clear by the third day. The cistern repair held. The south field received its first irrigation water on a Wednesday afternoon, and Elias stood at the head of the shallow channel and watched it move through the furrows he'd cut, soaking into the soil with a patience that matched his own. The land was thirsty. It took the water without ceremony, the way a tired animal drinks. He rode into Redemption Creek on a borrowed mule, borrowed from a widow named Agnes Pryor, whose small farm sat at the eastern mouth of the valley, and who had watched Elias's activity at the Harlan place with the cautious approval of a woman who had seen enough men fail there to be interested in one who seemed to be succeeding, and spent $3 on seed. Winter wheat primarily, because it was the right season for it, and because winter wheat required less water in the early stages than spring crops. A small amount of rye for the eastern edge where the soil was thinnest. Agnes Pryor told him, over the coffee she insisted on making when he returned the mule, that the two previous owners of the Harlan homestead had both experienced what she called discouraging incidents after conflicts with Aldrin. One man's fences had been cut 3 times in 1 month. The other had found half his livestock strayed from a pasture with a mysteriously open gate. Neither man had been able to prove anything, and neither had stayed past the first winter. "He doesn't do anything you can take to the sheriff directly," Agnes said. She was a stout, practical woman in her 60s, with white hair pinned under a work bonnet and hands that showed 40 years of farming. "He just makes things difficult enough, steadily enough, that people give up." "How'd he get the dam in place without anybody saying anything?" Elias asked. Agnes looked at him over her coffee cup. "The Harlan property was empty for almost a year before the auction. Nobody to say anything to." Elias nodded slowly. "And the creek water going north didn't strike anyone as odd?" "Hidden Valley doesn't have many people who go looking for odd things," Agnes said. "The ones who might have noticed were mostly Aldrin's people." She looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of an older woman who has reached the age where she has no patience for circling around the point. "He's going to try to run you off too, young man." "Maybe not with a fence cutter. Maybe not right away. But he's going to try." "I expect so," Elias said. She studied him. "Doesn't seem to bother you overmuch." "I've been cold, hungry, broke, and alone in worse country than this," Elias said. "A man who wants my water isn't the worst thing I've faced." Agnes Pryor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is the worst thing you've faced?" He looked at his coffee cup. "Losing my own place," he said. "Back in Missouri. Drought took it. I built that farm from raw ground over 7 years, and I lost it in 1 bad season." He paused. "I'm not interested in losing another one." Agnes nodded slowly. There was something in her expression, not pity, but recognition. "You'll do," she said, which seemed to be about the highest compliment available in her vocabulary. It was in the 3rd week, on a cold, clear morning with frost still white on the grass, that Elias found what was buried. He had been working on the back drainage, extending the irrigation channel behind the house to prevent the south field from flooding if the spring rains came heavy, and he was digging at a point about 22 feet from the back wall of the farmhouse, in the slight rise he had noticed on his first walk of the property. He had attributed the elevation to an old refuse pile, which was common enough on homestead properties, and had not given it particular thought. He was mostly interested in understanding the soil depth at this point, to know whether he needed to dig a drainage channel or could rely on natural percolation. He was about 16 inches down when his spade struck something that was not rock and not root. He stopped, tapped it again. The sound was hollow and dense at the same time, the particular sound of metal, or a metal container. He set the spade aside and knelt in the shallow excavation, using his hands to clear the soil away in careful layers. A few minutes of work exposed the top of a wooden box. A strong box, iron-banded, approximately 18 inches long and a foot wide, wrapped in a layer of oilcloth that had preserved it remarkably well beneath the earth. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but structurally solid. The iron bands were surface rusted but intact. There was a padlock on the front hasp. The padlock was old but had been oiled at some point. The mechanism showed the dull sheen of deliberate preservation. Elias sat back on his heels for a moment and looked at the box in the hole. His first thought was rational and practical. This could be anything. Tools, documents, family valuables left by the Harlan family before they abandoned the property. A keepsake burial, which was not uncommon. People buried things they couldn't carry. His second thought, arriving about 30 seconds behind the first, was less comfortable. Someone had maintained that diversion dam up the canyon. Someone had come back to that dam in the past year and restacked the stones and repacked the clay. Someone had a reason to keep people off this property. And the two previous owners had both left under circumstances that a generous woman like Agnes Pryor described only in careful, indirect language. He looked at the box. The box looked like it had been waiting. He got the long iron chisel from his tool bag, positioned it against the hasp fitting, and struck it twice with the flat of a hammer. The old wood around the hasp screws gave before the lock did, and the hasp pulled free, leaving the padlock dangling uselessly from the box lid. He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth and then in several folds of canvas, were three things. The first was a canvas bag, drawstring tied, that clinked when he lifted it. He opened it and poured a portion of its contents into his palm. Gold coins. Double eagles, mostly $20 gold pieces, along with a smaller number of $10 pieces and some loose gold dust in a separate small leather pouch. He counted without hurrying and arrived at an approximate total of somewhere between $800 and $1,000 in gold, possibly more. It was more money than he had seen in one place in his life. He set the bag carefully aside and looked at the second item. It was a document packet, sealed with wax that had survived its underground tenure better than anyone had a right to expect. He broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. There were several pages written in a careful, deliberate hand. Not the hand of an educated man exactly, but the hand of a man who understood that what he was writing needed to be legible and permanent. At the top of the first page, in larger letters, "This is the property and testimony of Wade Harlan, Hidden Valley, Arizona Territory, written in the year of our Lord, 1870. Elias read it slowly, sitting in the dirt with the frost melting off the grass around him and the early sun casting a long shadow behind him. Wade Harlan had discovered gold on his property in 1869. Not a vein, not a mine, but a pocket deposit in the creek bed, the kind of isolated accumulation that sometimes forms in the geological folds of canyon streams. He had worked it quietly for nearly a year, telling no one, accumulating the coins through a series of small transactions at different assay offices in different towns, so as not to draw attention. He had buried the strongbox on his property, intending to use the gold to improve the homestead, buy more land, and establish himself permanently in Hidden Valley. He had told one person. His neighbor to the north, Douglas Aldrin, in a moment of trust that he had immediately regretted. Within 3 months of that conversation, Harlan had been visited by Aldrin's men twice. The first visit was friendly, Aldrin offering to buy the Harlan property at a price that seemed reasonable on the surface, but was below market value. Harlan declined. The second visit was less friendly. Harlan had written in his testimony that he was not a fearful man, but that he was a practical one, and that he had decided to leave the property temporarily and wait for a better time to return and assert his claim. He had buried the gold and the testimony together, intending to come back. He never did come back, apparently. The testimony ended with a statement that if someone else was reading this document, it meant the property had changed hands, and that Harlan wanted it known that the gold was earned honestly, that the creek pocket had been fully worked out, and that the water rights for the creek belonged legally and morally to whoever held the deed to the homestead. Elias read it twice. Then he set it down and picked up the third item from the box. It was a second document, shorter, more recent. The paper was less aged than Harlan's testimony. At the top it read, "For whoever finds this." The handwriting was different, less careful, more hurried. It was signed by a man named James Cutter, who identified himself as the second owner of the Harlan homestead following Harlan's departure. Cutter wrote that he had found this box 3 months after purchasing the property, and that within 1 week of finding it, he had been approached by Douglas Aldrin with an offer to buy the property for the same below-market price Aldrin had offered Harlan. Cutter had refused. His fences had been cut. His livestock had strayed. His well had been contaminated with debris, which he suspected was not accidental. He was leaving, he wrote, because he had a wife, and he was not willing to put her in danger for a piece of land, no matter what was buried in it. But he was leaving this note because, he wrote, something needed to be done about Douglas Aldrin, and he hoped whoever read this had the stomach to do it. He had added a postscript. The creek deposit is worked out. The gold in the bag is what's left of it. Take it. It belongs to the homestead. Aldrin wants the land, but doesn't know about the gold, or he would have taken it when he drove me off. Don't let him have the land. Elias set the second document on top of the first and looked at both of them for a long time. The sun was fully up now, burning the frost off the grass. Somewhere up the canyon, the creek was running, doing what it was supposed to do, going where it was supposed to go. He looked at the gold. He looked at the documents. He looked at the farmhouse, his farmhouse, with its patched roof and its rehung shutters and its fireplace that was finally drawing clean. He picked up the canvas bag of gold, hefted it once, and set it down again. He stacked the documents carefully and folded them into his coat pocket. He closed the empty strongbox and pushed it aside. Then he sat in the dirt and thought for a very long time. He went to see the sheriff. Sheriff Roy Dunbar operated out of Redemption Creek from a small adobe office that always smelled of coffee and old leather and the particular staleness of a room where men spent a lot of time sitting and waiting. Dunbar was a rangy man in his early 50s, with a face like a sun-dried cliff face, all planes and angles, and the measured, unhurried manner of a man who had been dealing with other people's problems for 20 years and had arrived at a kind of professional equanimity about it. He read Harlan's testimony carefully, then Cutter's note. He set them both on his desk and looked at Elias across the scarred wood. "You know what you're asking me to do," Dunbar said. "I know what the documents say," Elias said. "What you do with them is your business." Dunbar leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Douglas Aldrin has been ranching Hidden Valley since before this town had a sheriff's office. He's got friends on the county commission. He's got a lawyer in Tucson on a retainer. "All true, I reckon," Elias said. "And you're a broke farmer who's been on his land for 3 weeks." "Also true." Dunbar looked at him. "Most men in your position, finding that gold, would take it and quietly move on." "Most men," Elias agreed. Another silence. Dunbar picked up Cutter's note again and read the last line one more time. "Don't let him have the land." "The water diversion is the clearest violation," the sheriff said finally, in the tone of a man thinking out loud. "That's documented. The survey records support your claim. Aldrin diverted a water source registered to your property. That's actionable." He paused. "The rest of it, what he may or may not have done to Harlan and Cutter, that's harder. There are no direct witnesses." "The documents establish a pattern," Elias said. "They establish a story," Dunbar said. "Not quite the same thing in a courtroom." But he was still holding Cutter's note, and something in his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly in the way a landscape shifts when the cloud cover moves and the light changes the distance. "What I can do," Dunbar said slowly, "is ride out to Aldrin's property with the survey documents and inform him that his water diversion was illegal and that you're pursuing the matter through the county land court. That puts it on the official record. That makes him respond officially." He set the note down. "Once it's official, it's harder to make problems that don't look like problems." "That would be a start," Elias said. Dunbar looked at him steadily. "You understand that making this official and making it stick are two different things. This could take a year to work through the land court. During that year, Aldrin is going to be an uncomfortable neighbor." "He already is," Elias said. Dunbar studied him for a moment longer. Those gray eyes, that level, measuring calm that had apparently decided something and committed to it. "What are you going to do with the gold?" the sheriff asked. "Part of it goes to the county land court filing fees and legal costs," Elias said. "Some of it goes to improvements on the property. The rest I'm holding in trust for James Cutter, if he can be found, since he's the one who left it." He paused. "Wade Harlan's family, if they can be located, has a claim on it too. I'll need a lawyer to sort it out properly." Dunbar was quiet for a moment. "You're an unusual man," he said finally. "Just a farmer," Elias said. The legal proceedings took 14 months. During those 14 months, Elias Cord planted 2 seasons of winter wheat and 1 of spring barley. He repaired the farmhouse so thoroughly that by the end of the first year, it bore little resemblance to the listing structure he had first walked into. He hired Agnes Pryor's grandson, a capable young man named Thomas, to help with the heavy clearing work during the spring. He bought a horse, a sound bay mare he named Creek, for obvious reasons, and a second-hand plow and a set of harrow teeth. He also had 2 more direct encounters with Douglas Aldrin. The first came 2 months after the sheriff's visit, when Aldrin's lawyer sent a formal letter disputing Elias's water rights claim and asserting that the creek had historically run north. A legal argument of spectacular audacity, given the survey documentation, which Elias's own lawyer, a young man from Tucson named Thomas Birch, who had taken the case partly out of professional interest and partly, Elias suspected, because he found the Harlan testimony historically fascinating, described as the kind of claim that wins by attrition, not by merit. The second came 6 months in, when Elias's fence along the northern property line was cut in 3 places over the course of a single night. He mended it the next morning and wrote a detailed letter to Sheriff Dunbar documenting the damage, the date, and the location. He did not accuse Aldrin directly in the letter because he had no proof. He did not need to. The letter became part of a file that was growing steadily thicker. Agnes Pryor said, when he told her about the fence, "Are you sure you want to keep pushing this? Aldrin's not a man who accepts losing gracefully." "I'm not pushing anything," Elias said. "I'm farming. He's the one who keeps interrupting it." She looked at him over her coffee. They had established a weekly pattern of coffee at her table, which had started as courtesy and become something between friendship and mutual reliance. "You know what the people in town are saying about you?" "I can imagine." "They're saying you're either brave or crazy, and they can't quite decide which." "Those aren't always different things," he said. She almost smiled at that. James Cutter was found in a town called Benson, 90 miles southeast, where he had been working as a livery manager since leaving Hidden Valley. When Sheriff Dunbar located him and sent word of the legal proceedings, Cutter wrote back a letter that arrived folded inside the official packet from the county land court, and which Elias read standing at the farmhouse table on a February morning with the first green shoots of his winter wheat just visible in the south field through the window. Cutter wrote that he was glad the land had found someone who would stand up for it. He wrote that he had thought about the gold many times, and that he had always felt badly about leaving it, about leaving the testimony he'd added to, about leaving in general, but that he'd had a wife to protect, and he was a practical man. He wrote that he had no claims on the gold, that whatever Elias determined was fair was fine with him, and that he hoped the county land court buried Aldrin. He added one more thing at the end, almost as an afterthought. He had heard, third or fourth hand, that Wade Harlan had died of fever in California in 1872, with no surviving family. He didn't know if that was relevant, but he thought Elias should know. Elias read this section twice. Then he folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket with the other documents, which he kept there now, close at hand, as a matter of habit. He went outside and stood on the porch stone and looked at the south field and the green shoots and the creek running clear and steady below the field edge. He thought about Wade Harlan, who had worked this same ground, found something unexpected, lost it all, and died far away without ever coming back to the land he had built. He thought about James Cutter, who had chosen his wife over a fight he couldn't win alone. He thought about Agnes Pryor, who had watched men fail here for years and kept her own farm running through sheer, stubborn competence. He thought about Douglas Aldrin, who had turned the water of a dead man's creek to his own use and called it 15 years of established practice. He went back inside and made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching his field. The county land court ruling came on a Thursday in late spring. It was unambiguous. Elias Cord held clear water rights to the creek and all tributaries running through his registered property. The diversion dam had constituted an illegal appropriation of those rights. Douglas Aldrin was ordered to pay a remediation fee to the court and was formally prohibited from any interference with the Harlan Homestead Creek flow. The second part of the ruling addressed the pattern of harassment documented in the testimony and supporting letters from Cutter, Elias, and Agnes Pryor, who had apparently decided, somewhere in the preceding months, that she was willing to put her name on a legal document. The court found insufficient direct evidence to impose criminal charges, but issued a formal judicial notice, a document that sat permanently in the public record, noting the established pattern and making clear that any future interference with the Harlan homestead would be prosecuted with the full weight of documented prior behavior. Aldrin did not appear in person at the ruling. His lawyer received it on his behalf. Elias rode back to Hidden Valley that afternoon with the court documents in his saddlebag and arrived at the homestead as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge, laying long shadows across the south field. The winter wheat was nearly full grown, standing in rows that were not perfect. The soil's unevenness, the irrigation variations, the record of all his learning and adjustment written in the small differences between rows, but were real and present and green in the late light. He unsaddled Creek at the small stable he'd built in October, rubbed her down, and gave her grain. He went inside and built a fire, made coffee, sat at the table with the court documents laid out in front of him, reading them again, not for information, but for the particular quality of reading something that had turned out the way it needed to. He thought about writing something. He wasn't a man given to correspondence, but he thought maybe he should write to Cutter, tell him it was done, that the land had held. He would write to him tomorrow. Tonight, he just sat and drank his coffee by the fire, in the house that was his, on the land that was his, with the creek running outside in the dark as it had always meant to run. Before we get to the end of this story, if you've made it this far, consider subscribing to the channel. Stories like this one go up regularly, and there's plenty more of the Old West waiting for you. In the summer of that year, Douglas Aldrin sold the northern portion of his property and moved his main operation east toward the better-watered grasslands near the territory's central plateau. There were various explanations offered in Redemption Creek for this decision: that his cattle operation had overextended, that the legal costs of the Hidden Valley dispute had strained his finances, that he had received a good offer from a cattlemen's consortium operating out of Tucson. All of these were probably true, to varying degrees. Agnes Pryor, when she heard the news, looked at Elias across her kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. "Does that feel like winning?" she asked finally. Elias considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "It feels like the water's running where it belongs," he said. "And I've got a good field coming in. I reckon that's what winning looks like for a farmer." Agnes poured more coffee. "What are you going to do with Harlan's gold, now that Cutter's disclaimed it and there's no family?" It was the question that had been sitting quietly at the edge of everything for over a year. Elias had thought about it more than he'd admitted to anyone. He had the legal advice from Birch, the young lawyer from Tucson. Without a living claimant, the gold was his by right of finder's possession on his own property. It was clean. It was legal. It was more money than he had ever owned or expected to own. Part of it built the stable and the new irrigation channel, he said. The legal fees came out of it. I'm holding the rest for now. He paused. I thought about whether to build something permanent with it, something that lasts. Like what? Agnes, he said. How much would it take to buy the east-facing acres on the canyon north side, now that Aldrin's selling? She looked at him. That's good land, she said carefully. It is, he agreed. It's well-watered and sheltered, and it runs right alongside the creek in the upper stretch. A man could do something serious with that land. She was quiet for a moment, something working behind her practical, experienced eyes. You're thinking about expanding. I'm thinking about building something that doesn't fall apart, he said. Something that's here in 20 years, that somebody else can build on after me. He was thinking about Wade Harlan, who had built and lost and never come back. He was thinking about the testimony in the strongbox, written in careful letters, buried in the ground because there was nobody else to tell. He was thinking about the difference between a man who works a piece of land and a man who becomes part of it. Agnes Pryor put her coffee cup down and looked at him for a long time with those clear, direct eyes. You'll do more than that, she said. And this time it wasn't her highest compliment. It was a predictio. Elias Cord bought the canyon acres in August. He began clearing them in September, working alongside Thomas and 2 additional men he hired for the season. The work was hard and methodical and deeply satisfying, in the way that foundational work is satisfying. Not the quick reward of a finished product, but the slow, accumulating satisfaction of something being built correctly from the ground up. He found nothing else buried on the new land. He looked because a man who had found one surprise in the ground had earned the right to check, but the canyon acres were ordinary in that regard. What they were was good. Good soil in the lower sections, good timber on the upper slopes, good water access through the creek that now ran freely along its eastern edge. By the following spring, the Cord Homestead — it had stopped being the Harlan Homestead in the community's language sometime in the winter, a transition that happened without announcement, simply because the land had started to match the man who worked it — comprised nearly 160 acres of Hidden Valley's floor and canyon margin. The farmhouse had been expanded by 2 rooms. A proper barn stood where the rickety stable had been. The south field and the new east field together put Elias in a position to sell surplus grain at the Redemption Creek market for the first time, which was the threshold in farming where surviving becomes building. He rode into town on a market Thursday with a wagon load of winter wheat that was the first surplus he had ever produced on his own land, in his own name, from seed he had planted with his own hands in soil that had been close to dead when he arrived. He sold it at a fair price to the grain merchant, pocketed the money, and sat in the wagon for a moment before turning creek toward home. He thought about the morning he had stood at the property line with his canvas bag and his $62, and looked at the leaning house and the thin grass and the retreating creek and the sky that couldn't make up its mind. He thought about the whisper that had followed him from the auction table. The land had already killed 2 men. He thought about the strong box 22 feet from the back wall, patient in the dark, waiting for someone to come along who wouldn't run. He clucked to creek and turned the wagon east, toward the valley, toward home. The land had killed 2 men, people said. It hadn't killed Elias Cord. He reckoned that was the beginning of a different story entirely. If this story moved you, the grit, the patience, the quiet kind of courage it takes to hold ground when everything says let go, then subscribe to the channel. Every week, another story from the Old West, where the land tests the man and the man answers back. Don't miss what comes next.